From the deserts of Arabia to the classrooms of Princeton, Samuel Zwemer, known as the Apostle to Islam, lived a life of fearless faith and sacrificial love. He gave up comfort, endured loss, and spent decades sharing the gospel in one of the hardest mission fields on earth. This is the powerful, true story of a man who refused to count the cost, believing that no sacrifice was too great for Christ. If you're inspired by stories of faith and courage, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it so others can hear the testimony of a life fully surrendered to God. The wind swept over the low plains of Michigan, brushing through the trees surrounding the small town of Friesland. It was April 12, 1867, when a child was born to the Dutch Reformed Zwemer family, Samuel Marinus Zwemer. The 11th of 15 children, Samuel came into a household thick with faith, prayer, and the firm rhythms of Calvinist devotion. His parents, Dutch immigrants steeped in the traditions of Reformed piety, believed in the sovereignty of God and the call to holiness. In such a home, the seeds of missionary zeal took root early. As a boy, Samuel was known for his sharp mind and quick tongue, but it was the steady faith of his family that shaped his inner world. Each day began and ended with prayer. Church was not just a weekly ritual, it was the centerpiece of community and life. Stories of men like David Livingstone and Hudson Taylor filled Samuel's imagination. He began to think not only of God, but of the unreached corners of the world where the gospel had yet to be proclaimed. By his teenage years, Samuel had resolved to dedicate his life to Christian service. After completing preparatory studies, he enrolled at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. His intellect flourished, but it was his spiritual hunger that distinguished him. Friends recalled him as both brilliant and burdened. He would retreat often to pray, his journal filled with questions not about academic success, but about eternal significance. In 1887, Samuel entered New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Jersey, the training ground for Dutch Reformed ministers. It was there that the call of missions became a roar in his spirit. A turning point came when he heard a stirring sermon about the spiritual needs of the Muslim world. Islam was often discussed with suspicion or fear, but Samuel was intrigued. Here was a world religion that knew of Jesus, but not his saving grace. Wrote millions, prayed, fasted, and believed, but lacked the cross. Could it be that God was calling him to go? While his peers envisioned pulpits in safe communities across America, Samuel's eyes turned eastward. He devoured books on Islam and the Arabic language. When other students joined student clubs or pursued romantic attachments, Zwemer was memorizing Arabic phrases and praying for Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, a land nearly untouched by Christian witness. In 1889, he met James Cantine, a fellow student who shared his passion. Cantine, like Zwemer, was stirred by the thought of pioneering work among Muslims. Together, the two began to dream. Could they, with no support base, no formal mission board, and no guarantees, plant the gospel in the heart of Islam? It seemed impossible. Arabia was called the closed land. Missionaries had tried and failed. The climate was brutal, the diseases deadly, and the language impenetrable. Christians were viewed with hostility and conversion was forbidden. Yet the two men felt a holy fire burning in their bones. If Christ was Lord, then no place was too hard, no people too resistant. They proposed their vision to the Reformed Church Missions Board. The response was cautious, then negative. Too dangerous, they were told, no precedent. But rejection did not extinguish their conviction. Zwemer and Cantine decided to found their own mission society. They called it the Arabian Mission and began raising support themselves, knocking on doors, preaching in churches, and pleading for prayer. Zwemer's passion was contagious. His words dripped with conviction. If God calls you to be a missionary, he would later say, don't stoop to be a king. That conviction, radical and countercultural, would define his life. In 1890, with enough funds scraped together, the two young men prepared to sail. They were not backed by a major denomination. They had no guarantees of safety, health, or return, but they had a clear calling. Samuel Zwemer, just 23 years old, boarded the ship with a heart burning for Arabia, a Bible in his bag, and eternity in his eyes. The sea wind was sharp as the ship crossed the Atlantic, but nothing compared to the heat that awaited them. Samuel Zwemer and James Cantine arrived first in Beirut, Lebanon, a city with a long Christian history and many mission outposts. But Beirut was not their destination. It was merely a place to learn, to adapt, to prepare. Zwemer immersed himself in Arabic studies. Fluent communication was essential not only for evangelism but for survival. He walked the dusty streets, spoke with local scholars, and read Islamic texts with a hunger to understand. While many missionaries focus on superficial engagement, Zwemer studied Islam's heart, its theology, its scriptures, its culture. He wanted to preach Christ not as a stranger, but as one who had entered their world. From Beirut, Zwemer and Canteen pressed southward. Bahrain became their base of operations. Located in the Persian Gulf, it was a strategic launching pad to reach eastern Arabia. The region was a furnace, scorched by day, suffocating by night. Water was scarce. Malaria, dysentery, and cholera stalked every corner. But the greatest challenge was not the climate, it was the spiritual resistance. Islam was not a religion of apathy. It was deeply rooted, passionately defended. Conversion to Christianity was unthinkable, a betrayal of family, tribe, and faith. Yet, Zwemer and Canteen did not shrink back. They opened a small medical clinic, handed out tracts, and engaged in daily conversations. Progress was slow, painfully so. Years passed with no visible converts, but the seed was being planted. In 1896, Zwemer married Amy Wilkes, a fellow missionary with a heart as brave as his. Their wedding was held in Bahrain under the shadow of the minarets. Together, they served in Basra, Muscat, and other key cities across Arabia and the Persian Gulf. They built relationships, offered medical care, and gently proclaimed the gospel. Their home became a hub of hospitality and witness. The Zwemers faced unimaginable loss. 2 of their young daughters died in the mission field, victims of illness. The grief was unspeakable. Amy, a mother mourning her children in a foreign land, bore her sorrow with grace and resolve. Zwemer himself was shattered but not broken. He wrote, "The sheer joy of service in a hard field is the nearest thing to the joy of heaven." Despite the pain, Zwemer pressed forward. He began writing articles, booklets, and entire books aimed at awakening the Western Church to the Muslim world. His most famous early work, The Muslim World, offered a deep and respectful analysis of Islamic faith, urging Christians not to fear Muslims but to love them with Christ-like passion. His scholarship was extraordinary. Zwemer was not content to be a mere preacher. He became one of the foremost Christian scholars on Islam of his time. He read the Quran in Arabic, engaged Muslim thinkers with intelligence and compassion, and refused to caricature or demonize Islam. His writings were marked by bold truth and deep love. The Arabian mission grew slowly. More workers joined, but the fruit remained sparse. Years of labor often resulted in mere conversations. Converts were rare. Yet Zwemer believed that success was measured not in numbers, but in obedience. He said, "The missionary task is to proclaim Christ, whether or not men respond." By 1905, Samuel Zwemer had become a voice of authority. His writings were being circulated widely in Europe and America. He traveled often to raise support, not just for Arabia, but for Muslim missions globally. His heart ached for North Africa, Central Asia, India, and the Balkans. Anywhere Islam had taken root. He wanted to see a gospel movement birthed across the Islamic world, but his method was never forceful. Zwemer understood that the work among Muslims required patience, respect, and deep spiritual preparation. He called for prayer, fasting, and theological clarity. He trained young missionaries to study Islamic culture deeply before preaching. He emphasized that Jesus was not a Western savior, but a global redeemer. His message was clear: the love of Christ must shine brighter than the crescent. By the early 1900s, Samuel Zwemer had become more than a missionary, he had become a movement. Though based in the Middle East, his voice echoed across Europe and North America. His writings, lectures, and personal appeals were awakening a sleeping church to the reality that over 200 million Muslims lived and died without the gospel. In 1906, Zwemer returned to the United States for an extended period. While his heart still burned for Arabia, a new opportunity had opened, one that would shape the direction of Muslim missions for decades. Princeton Theological Seminary invited him to lecture on missions in Islam. It was an unusual role for a field missionary, but Zwemer saw the chance to multiply his influence. Teaching future pastors and missionaries about the Muslim world would sow seeds far beyond his reach. At Princeton, he poured himself into scholarship. He didn't approach Islam as an outsider throwing stones, but as a devoted Christian who had walked its streets, spoken its language, and known its people. He lectured with precision and passion, blending cultural insight with biblical depth. His students were gripped, not by fear of Islam, but by a holy longing to reach Muslims with the love of Christ. Even while teaching, Zwemer never lost his identity as a missionary. He used every vacation and break to travel: Egypt, Turkey, Syria, India. His feet touched soil in dozens of Muslim-majority nations. In Cairo, he helped launch The Muslim World, a scholarly journal dedicated to understanding and engaging Islam from a Christian perspective. Zwemer served as its editor for years, ensuring that its tone remained both truthful and respectful. He was tireless. In 1907, he helped organize the Cairo Conference, a historic gathering of over 60 missionaries and scholars focused solely on Muslim evangelism. It was the first international consultation of its kind. Attendees wrestled with hard questions. How do we share Christ with people who already believe in one God? What is the role of friendship, culture, and language? How do we prepare for persecution? Zwemer's leadership at the conference was humble but strong. He called on workers to abandon romanticized expectations and embrace long, faithful service. We must evangelize the Muslim, he said, at the cost of all things, yes, even life itself. As World War I swept across Europe and the Middle East, Zwemer's ministry took on a new urgency. The war devastated mission work in many areas. Travel became dangerous, supplies were scarce, suspicion of foreigners, especially Christian missionaries, intensified. Yet Zwemer pressed forward. He published even more, writing books like Islam, A Challenge to Faith, and The Cross Above the Crescent. These were not triumphalist polemics. They were passionate pleas for the church to wake up. He challenged the Western church's comfort. If we believe in the Great Commission, he asked, how can we justify leaving whole nations without a witness to Christ? He warned against missionary tourism, against shallow conversions, and against compromise. He called for a return to gospel depth, sacrifice, and intercession. During this time, Amy remained his anchor. Though they faced health issues and personal loss, she supported him unwaveringly. Their marriage, forged in the fires of grief and glory, was a testimony of mutual calling. They had known heartbreak, their 2 children buried in Arabian soil, but they also knew the peace of obedience. Together, they had built something eternal. Zwemer became known as the apostle to Islam, not because of massive conversions, but because of his singular focus and extraordinary impact. By 1920, he had preached on 5 continents, written more than 50 books and pamphlets, and trained hundreds of missionaries. He had lifted Muslim missions from obscurity to global awareness. Churches in America, Europe, and Asia were now praying for the Muslim world, funding workers and sending their best. For Zwemer, the mission was not finished. The statistics were overwhelming. Millions of Muslims had never heard the gospel in a language they understood. He knew that the real work was just beginning. The 1920s opened with fresh opportunities. Though advancing in age, Samuel Zwemer showed no signs of slowing down. He returned to Cairo to resume full-time work, this time under the Near East Mission and the American University. Cairo was becoming an intellectual capital in the Islamic world, and Zwemer believed that if Christian witness could take root there, it could echo throughout the Muslim world. In Cairo, Zwemer and his colleagues launched a series of Arabic-language Christian publications designed to respectfully engage Islamic thought. He helped train local believers, encourage evangelistic outreach, and corresponded with seekers across the region. Though conversions remained rare and often secret, Zwemer believed that God was working below the surface. Skill continued to write at a remarkable pace. His books tackled complex theological and cultural issues with clarity. Titles like The Glory of the Cross, The Disintegration of Islam, and Studies in Popular Islam showcase his grasp of both doctrine and human longing. He never shied away from truth, but neither did he fail to show compassion. His writings balanced the urgency of salvation with the patience of love. By now, Zwemer was invited to speak in nearly every major Christian mission conference. He traveled to China, India, Indonesia, and across Africa, each time urging workers not to overlook the Muslim world. He spoke not with bitterness at the hardness of hearts, but with tears for the souls still unreached. Islam is a challenge, he often said, but it is not a wall, it is a door. Despite his influence, Zwemer never sought popularity. He had faced criticism from both liberal theologians and conservative pastors. Some felt his respect for Islam bordered on accommodation. Others thought his uncompromising gospel message too harsh. But Zwemer walked a middle road, firm in doctrine, rich in love. The 1930s and 40s brought deep reflection. The world had changed. Colonialism was crumbling. Nationalism was rising. In Muslim-majority nations, the church was wrestling with how to evangelize in post-colonial contexts. Zwemer's voice remained steady. He had long rejected imperialistic missions and emphasized the need for indigenous leadership, local churches, and discipleship over numbers. Even as his body grew frail, Zwemer's pen remained strong. In his later writings, a deeper intimacy with Christ emerges. He wrote more on prayer, the cross, and the sweetness of communion with God. He no longer focused only on Islam, but on the person of Jesus, exalting him with simplicity and reverence. He had lived through loss, loneliness, and years of apparent fruitlessness. Yet there was no regret. In one of his final lectures, he said, "No work is more rewarding than to preach Christ where he is least known, to serve where there is no applause, and to labor in hope where only heaven can count the fruit." On April 2, 1952, Samuel Zwemer breathed his last. He was nearly 85 years old. His funeral was not marked by global headlines or massive crowds, but around the world, in Cairo, in Bahrain, in Princeton, and in the quiet prayer closets of missionaries, he was remembered as a giant. He had pioneered gospel witness to Muslims when few dared. He had shown the church that Islam was not an enemy to fear, but a field to love. His life was a sermon, his writings a legacy, his passion a spark passed on. After Samuel Zwemer's passing in 1952, it would have been easy for the world to move on. His name never reached the fame of Billy Graham or the theological stature of Karl Barth, but among the people he inspired, Zwemer's memory did not fade, it deepened. His legacy was not a monument, but a movement. In seminaries and missions agencies across the globe, his writings became required reading. The Muslim World, the journal he edited and nurtured for decades, remained in print for generations, shaping dialogue between Christians and Muslims. His books, many written with ink-stained fingers in dim Arabian rooms, continue to instruct missionaries, scholars, and pastors alike. But his most enduring legacy was not in pages or pulpits, it was in lives. A generation of missionaries rose up, fueled by his vision. Men and women who had once feared Islam began to love Muslims. Entire mission societies realigned their focus to include the Muslim world. Prayer networks formed, missionary training schools added Islamic studies programs. Zwemer had shifted the imagination of the church. His emphasis on respectful engagement also laid the groundwork for a more relational approach to missions. He taught that sharing Christ meant more than winning arguments. It meant living with integrity, loving without condition, and preaching a crucified Savior with clarity and compassion. Even when converts remained few, the witness had to remain pure. Zwemer's balanced posture, uncompromising in gospel truth, yet deeply empathetic, was decades ahead of his time. In an age when many approached missions as a civilizing project, he viewed Muslims not as pagans to be corrected, but as image bearers of God in desperate need of grace. This theological foundation gave his work lasting relevance. As decades passed, his influence was felt in unexpected places. Muslim background believers, men and women who had risked everything to follow Jesus, found courage in his story. Church planters in North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East cited Zwemer's writings as formative. Evangelists in closed countries read his books secretly, drawing strength from his perseverance. Today, Zwemer's name lives on in institutions and awards bearing his name. The Zwemer Center for Muslim Studies at Columbia International University continues his vision, training believers to understand, love, and reach the Muslim world with humility and boldness. His life is studied not just as a model of missions, but as a model of faithfulness. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy is this: Samuel Zwemer never measured success by visible results. He didn't need crowds, conversions, or credentials to validate his calling. He believed that the worth of a mission was found in the worthiness of the one who sent him. Christ alone was enough. In his later years, reflecting on a life poured out, Zwemer wrote these words: "The kingdoms of this world and all their glory fade like shadows. Only what is done for Christ will last. Let us give ourselves wholly, willingly, joyfully to the task of making him known." The man who had buried his children in the sands of Arabia, who had walked hostile streets with tracts in his hand and scripture in his heart, who had stared down apathy in the Western church and hostility in the East, this man died with peace, not because he saw multitudes saved, but because he had obeyed the call. His life still speaks. In every closed land where the gospel is whispered in secret, in every prayer meeting pleading for unreached peoples, in every act of costly obedience, Zwemer's voice echoes, "Don't stoop to be a king when God calls you to be a missionary." He was not a hero in the eyes of the world, but in the courts of heaven, where obedience weighs more than applause, Samuel Zwemer is remembered. His life was a flame, and it still burns. Key lessons from Samuel Zwemer's life: 1. Obedience matters more than outcomes. Zwemer served for decades with little visible fruit, but he never gave up. 2. Respect opens doors. He studied Islam deeply, engaging Muslims with truth and dignity. 3. God calls individuals, not crowds. Even when mission boards said no, Zwemer said yes to God's call. 4. Sacrifice is the soil of impact. Zwemer buried his children abroad but continued to serve with joy. 5. Intellectual depth and spiritual fire go together. He was both a scholar and a soul winner. 6. Prayer is the foundation of missions. Zwemer believed lasting fruit in Muslim work only came through intercession. 7. Love your enemies by laying down your life. He never attacked Islam. He lifted up Christ. 8. Train others to go further than you. His Princeton students reached nations he never could. 9. True legacy is measured in obedience, not applause. Zwemer lived with no regrets because he lived for Christ alone. 10. The mission is unfinished. His work continues in the hands of those willing to go.